So I guess I'm just wondering where Romans 13 fits in,
Yeah.
where we're to be submissive because God places them in authority over the government in authority over us.
Yeah,
Can you
good
speak
question.
to that?
Yeah. So Romans 13 is a very important text. It's a very important passage in terms of the role of the state. There, Paul makes clear that the state is meant to be a ministry of justice. That its role, actually the Greek text there says that their state is God's servant, God's diaconate, right? So, which literally, diaconate, diakonos means servant. It's God's servant for your good. Notice Paul goes on to say there that the task of the state is to punish evil and reward righteousness. And we're to submit to that, right? For the honor of God and for a stable society, a stable social order. What happens when the state punishes righteousness and rewards evil? It ceased to be God's servant. So the initial response of the Christian in that situation means that we're good citizens up to the point where we're being required to disobey God or forbidden to obey God. And then we need to resist. And that takes the form initially of passive resistance. People forget that when the early church was persecuted, and I do think this is an important point to make, we should not romanticize persecution. We have never really experienced persecution, not of this nature. Much of the church has in the modern world, in the Islamic world, in some of the communist world, it's experienced real persecution. But you hear some people say, oh, well, perhaps it's good that the culture's getting worse and worse because then, the church will be persecuted and, that brings more people to the Lord. Well, that is pious gush. Right? The early church never prayed to be persecuted. You saw how they prayed, right? To live peaceful and godly lives. That's what they prayed for, to be given freedom. So we're not to be masochistic as Christians and pray for persecution with the thought that, it's a fact that God in his mercy and sovereignty turns situations of suffering and has turned situations of suffering for the good. And we hear the phrase, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. But the Christians were persecuted, as I outlined in my lecture, and they were martyred because they were resisting, and their only possibility of resistance at that time, right? There weren't Christian magistrates they could appeal to and so forth. They resisted by saying, we will not offer incense to Caesar. Jesus Christ is Lord. And that's why they were martyred. So that was not just a declaration of their personal salvation. It was resistance to a particular view of culture and of the state. So resistance initially can take that form. Now the Americans would say, and many of the reformers would have said, that if you are in a context where there is more freedom, and there are legitimate authorities that are ready to resist tyranny within a social order, within a culture, then more than passive resistance is acceptable. So the Americans in the Revolutionary War, I say the Americans, they were English settlers, so it was a squabble between cousins, but the English settlers said, look, why are we being taxed without representation in Parliament? This can't continue. And the English king was very stupid, and there were lots of people like Wilberforce in the British Parliament who were calling for the freedom of the American colonies, political freedom for the American colonies. But that argument didn't win the day, and it led to a squabble between the regulars and an American militia. And so there have been arguments for just resistance, just as there have been arguments for just war. Bonhoeffer was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. So I think that the reformers would say, if you're in a culture where there are different lesser magistrates or other powers within that culture that are resisting tyranny, that are legitimately established powers, then resistance can be more than passive resistance. But you never get, in the Christian view, a revolutionary approach to these things. Even the English Revolution with Oliver Cromwell, who was a great hero of mine, that was about the king's refusal to call Parliament for 11 years and try and tax the people to fund his foreign wars, and his sidling up to the Catholic powers in Europe, which they thought was treasonous. So it was the war of Parliament and the king. So Christians there, evangelical Christians, resisted by force of arms because Parliament was with them. In fact, they made up much of Parliament. So that question it's complex, but our starting point is a passive resistance to tyranny.